So welcome everyone to this series of classes called Birthing Your Resurrection Body. And as you may know, this is going to be a series of 6 classes on Thursday nights for the next 6 weeks through July the 2nd. And we're very excited and very happy to have this opportunity to share with you. And a lot of times when you take a class, the goal is just to acquire a lot of knowledge, and we certainly hope that you're going to learn many useful things from these series of classes. But what we're really hoping is that you can begin to discover what the Sufis call revealed knowledge. And this is knowledge that doesn't come from a book. This is knowledge that comes from personal and direct experience. And so Ravani and I would kind of share our kind of broad aims for this, and then we'll start going into some of the topics in brief tonight, but of course in a lot more detail as we go along. So we think of ourselves and experience ourselves generally as our physical beings, our personalities, our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies that have been in this life for how many years, going through space and time. And generally when people think about the spiritual journey, they think about this aspect of themselves that's moving towards a particular goal, which in the Sufis is generally described as illumination or awakening. And in our particular tradition, what Hazrat Inayat Khan brought forth, the aim is awakening in life. It's awakening the unique divinity of our being in life. So we're going to be talking about, well, what does that mean? And you might think it means, well, you're going to just become this transformed being, but you'll be walking around and it'll be the same world you're going around in, but just you're different. But in actuality, we're going to discover the world that you experience yourself in is a totally transformed one. And not only that, your being is helping to bring about further transformation of everything that you encounter, whether it's in this realm of reality or whether it's in subtle realms of reality. So we're wanting to discover how to access the truth and the fullness of who we actually are, and also awaken to the reality in which we already exist, but in our perception, our sense is that we're existing in just the tiniest sliver, shadow of what that reality actually is.
A lot of what I'm going to be presenting comes from the Zoroastrian tradition. One reason that we have taken a special look at what has come from the Zoroastrians, first of all, Pir Vilayat had a book on his shelf called Spiritual Body, Celestial Earth by Henri Corbin, and recommended it to us as the spiritual aspirants at that time. This book is one which Henri Corbin, who is an Orientalist that went to live in the Middle East for a long time, and translated many writings from the ancient Sufis, and even before that from the what they learned from the Zoroastrian traditions. And that time there was so much to offer in regards to a place between the mind and the body, which we don't put very much emphasis on in our descriptions of who people are in these days, but it would be something very helpful to us because it is a place of where transformation can happen, where actually the spiritual can come into body and body can become spiritual. So it's a meeting place. And really all of the practices and all the work that we do in the spiritual realm is supposedly done in this middle realm, because it's actually a barzakh is one way of speaking about it, or an interface between the two kinds of realms. And also this is a place where the things that we accomplish in our spiritual lives have bodiness, really have corporeality, a feeling to them that is unlike the mind and is unlike the physical body. There's extent, there is certainly feeling. In fact, the feeling there supposedly is much more enhanced than the feeling we have and all the senses that we have in what we see as our material life. So I'll be bringing some of the things that really will enhance our spiritual practices, I feel, through the discoveries that they made 2,000 and more years ago. One of them I'd like to name is called Geosophy. Geo and then Sophie, which is the earth and the archangel of the earth. And this, as well as some of the things Azerbaijan was just saying, are coincidentia oppositorium, which means unity of opposites, that you might feel, as he was saying, that you are progressing on a spiritual path as an independent being, but you're actually, at the same time, there is a transformation of the whole story of the universe as we are progressing. So two things happening at once, unity of these opposites. We'll see this happening in many spheres as we describe the spiritual path.
So Hasranai Khan has this beautiful image that many of you are familiar with of the divine central sun, and each of our souls being as a ray of light coming from that sun, emanating from that sun, all the way through all the different planes or realms of existence, all the way down to physical manifestation. And our identification typically is at the furthest end of that ray in the physical realm, and we think that that's all that there is to our being. And then our goal is, at least in many spiritual traditions, is to go back to where we came from, to merge into the one, and a dissolution of any individuality. But what Mershid really brought, his teachings, was not that. It was the awakening in life. It was awakening to the fact that we are the totality of that ray. And our experience is always based on the two sides of where we are on that ray. So like the maps we see at a rest stop, you are here. Well, you are here is where your consciousness is in your state of evolution on your spiritual journey in terms of how you're relating to what I like to call the rest of yourself, or you can call it your transcendent self or your divine being, or even Arbi talks about our Rab, our ABV, or personal Lord, or the Zoroastrians talk about our personal angel. Well, that path of discovering all the ways of relationship all along that ray is not a linear end. So some concepts that many of you are familiar with are, the first is Fana, F-A-N-A, which means shattering or annihilation, and baqa, B-A-Q-A, which means rebirth or resurrection. And this is not a one-time deal, and all of us can probably think of multiple times in our lives where we've gone through quantum shifts in our state of being, which may have been brought about by deep spiritual realization, but also may have been brought about by tragedy and trauma, a loss, a serious illness, and so on. But something that pulled the rug out from under us, that it no longer worked to feel and believe that the world was the way that we thought it was. And then there's always a period of in-between time when we don't know what's going to emerge from that. It's kind of a hatching period. And from that emerges a higher state of being or a higher state of self-organization. So many of the things we're going to be talking about in this series is what happens in that in-between state between the release of your previous sense of identification and the reemergence of a higher state of identification. And a lot of that has to remain outside the scope of our usual concepts, because if we're just trying to tack on some more thoughts based on how we think things are, and a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that, then we can never have the breakthroughs that are necessary on our journey of awakening. So we're going to learn ways to welcome that unknowingness with a feeling of deep trust and conviction that we are moving towards a higher state of being. It's not a state where we're just going to lose ourselves.
Some of this reminds me too of a word that we've seen now in the Zoroastrian tradition, but is very well a part of the Sufi tradition too, called Tawil, Tawil, which has to do with seeing that which transpires behind that which appears, which is the title of one of Pir Vilay's books. And it has to do with really seeing what's the deep story, the subtlety behind what appears. I've had a chance to be out in nature, maybe some of you also more lately, staying at home, and am so appreciative of what I find in nature, and I find stories that seem to be reflective of my own heart many of the times, and I feel I see little birds chirping and learning how to eat for the first time when their moms have been feeding them, but now they're having to go out and find their own little worms, and all of these stories happening all around us is so reflective of what's happening within our own hearts. So the Tawil has to do with seeing what is behind is everything, but it also has to do with honoring all of the layers of consciousness and of reality that there are, and pledging ourselves to opening those places and sanctifying and offering them to the divine, which helps us to not only move towards our own resurrection, we're going to talk about that some in this class, but also to really open pathways for others, appreciating the resonances there are in life, appreciating the harmonies that there are in life. And as we appreciate them, just like we said about the coincidentia oppositorium, two things are happening at the same time. We are realizing it for our own benefit, but it's also realized for others' benefit, and really for aligning these places in the earths themselves. So it is a great work that we do when we do our spiritual work. And through the eyes of some of these beings that we'll be bringing up through this Zoroastrian / Sufi tradition, I feel that we'll be honoring and hallowing and really making adamant some of these places and these transformations, because the world needs it right now. And we can do something in a spiritual way that has great benefit for the world itself.
So this principle of Tawil, which is also described as harmonic perception, and Pir Vilayat would describe it as seeing that which transpires behind that which appears, seeing the archetypal nature of something. I think one way that many of us probably have thought about that is, well, now we're here, but now we're seeing something like you might see through a microscope or a telescope, opening up something that's over there, and we're seeing the true reality of something. But in fact, we couldn't possibly have that experience of relationship with what we're experiencing unless we were in that same state of being, on that same level of resonance as what it is that we're experiencing. So this is going to be something we'll be coming back to many times in the course of this, that the experiences that we're having are not something here in our usual sense of physical reality, just kind of blopping up to some other state and coming back down, kind of taking a periscope and looking around, but it's realizing an aspect of ourself that is always there, but it's been latent or dormant. Now the way that this happens for us, the way that this unfoldment takes place, there's a beautiful term called the allegory of the soul, and there have been allegories of the soul written. There's one book about Avicenna's allegory of the soul, and Ibn Arabi's experiences, and certainly the Prophet Muhammad's experiences of the allegory of his soul. And the allegory of every soul is totally unique. And for those of you who are familiar with Ibn Arabi, if I had to just distill one thing of everything he ever said that to me is the most wonderful, it would be that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has or has had or ever could have access to except through each unique soul. And so there's something that is fulfilled in our awakening. And as Ravani Rao was talking about, well, it isn't just us that's having this transformation, it's transforming the world. But in actuality, it's transforming the divine being. It's fulfilling the purpose of the divine being that takes place through each of us discovering that way of unfoldment in our lives, which to me is another way of describing what Dharma is, our true purpose or our true duty, which is different for each person. And the way of doing that could be in so many different ways. It could be that of a scientist, and Mershid said it could be that of a businessman or a philosopher or a musician or a poet or an artist or a religious person. But it's that which brings the most fulfillment to our being in the expression of what comes from that awakening of our connection between the manifest part of ourselves with the transcendent or the divine part of our being. That's what unfolds the divine creative process. And we'll be talking a lot about that.
So this kind of brings in the idea of the imagination also, that again is considered in the Zoroastrian tradition as actually an organ of the soul, and surpasses the existence of the material body and carries us on above the other realms. And they speak about it as called the active imagination, especially the active imagination, and then even higher would be the royal imagination. They would say, and then the true imagination. These are use of our imaginative faculties, but in harmony with the ideas and established realizations of other beings. So that it is, maybe you could say, a tethered imagination that is in harmony, I would say, more than that, harmony with other thinking minds and beings. And in this thinking, it's a power capable of substantiating and revivifying, they say. And it's the seat of a power called Mater Vitae, the mother of the living. So what we are working with in our practicing and in our visualizing is, as we progress and gain many of the different wazifas, the power of many of the different wazifas that we work with, and the powers of our practices that we work with, can, as they say, substantiate and revivify, make life more of life, and create actual changes in the world. It is something that is, again, something that lasts longer than the bodies themselves. A lot of people think of the imagination, oh, it's very nice, it's one of the things that our brain can do. Well, no, it's actually way more than that. Some of the things actually that we're using in our practices are really elements of higher realms that we are operating with. It's quite phenomenal to think how we are really voyaging on different levels of reality and different ways of being. And we think that a lot of this is happening just on our material world. And this goes back again to the idea of identifying the world in which the imagery and the thoughts and understandings and especially visualizations occur, and dignifying that, and just realizing how much that really can accomplish.
So Hazrat Khan has said that the human being is the only being in the whole universe that has its existence in every realm of being, every plane. but our function in those subtle realms is dormant and latent for most people, and generally has no connection with what's going on in our walking around state of being. But we can become capable. Pure Vilayat described it as stereoscopic consciousness, being able to experience two sides simultaneously. And I like to call it multimodal consciousness, which means that we could have even more than two, multiple levels of functioning of our being, all working together, all circulating together. And it doesn't mean our consciousness all the time is going to be trying to take in what's going on in all those different places. We couldn't, but we can still have that experience of the vastness of ourself. And at the same time, and this is important, be firmly grounded in manifestation. And a little caveat here, manifestation is much more than what we think it is. Doesn't mean, well, yes, we say have our feet on the ground, but we're going to be talking about, well, what ground is it that we have our feet on? It's a much more expansive world than we think. So I'll bring in a little science that some of you have perhaps heard me talk about before. There's a wonderful scientist named William Tiller, who's a professor emeritus from Stanford. And for decades now, he's been doing really serious, very credible research on subtle energy. Replicable, I mean, if someone has an open mind, they can repeat his results. And some of his most famous results, one of them is he took a group of 4 experienced meditators and took, let's say you took a old computer that wasn't working and you took, carved out 1 square inch of the motherboard and you put it in the middle of the table. So if you're in Tiller's experiment, he's going to say, well, get 3 other experienced meditators, sit around the table and try to put an intention that will be stored in this little bit of circuit board that has no power, shouldn't be able to do anything, that when it goes to another lab, and it could be on the other side of the world, and it's just put next to a beaker of water that has a pH meter hooked up to it, it'll raise the pH 1 point with no contact whatsoever. And you might hear that and go, that's crazy, that couldn't possibly happen. Well, that's been done many times. If the intention is to lower at 1 point, that happens too. And even more amazing, the basic usual principles of thermodynamics are altered in that laboratory. You may have heard of entropy, which means disorder. Disorder is always increasing. If your desk is like mine, it always gets messier. It doesn't matter, you straighten it up, in a couple months it's going to be messier. But in this laboratory, the entropy actually decreased. There was more order, which shouldn't happen according to the second law of thermodynamics, but it did. And how did this come about? Well, he's got all kinds of explanations in math beyond my math degree understanding from Stanford undergraduate degree of what happens when you link a subtle level of reality with what he calls ordinary reality. Now things become possible that weren't possible before. He says the space has become conditioned with subtle energy. Well, I think this is a scientific way of describing what happens anytime we have a deep experience. It could be in meditation, it could be doing spiritual practices, but it could also be being in a beautiful place in nature, listening to wonderful music, looking at art or hearing poetry that's very moving. It could be a scientist having this aha moment, something that just opens up something that wasn't there before, is bringing about the same phenomena, and it's actually transforming the whole space around it. So we literally can bring about a transformation that's measurable in ordinary physical space by our consciousness. Well, what could happen if lots of people start doing that? What could happen if lots of people awaken to their higher order of who they really are and learn to function from that? Well, I'll share one more bit of science that was done with random number generators. So a man named Roger Nelson used to be at Princeton and had a laboratory where he had a little device, not very interesting. All it would do is put out a string of random numbers and record them. And he would have people come in and the instructions would be, see if you can alter the output so it's not random. And many people could do that, which is already pretty remarkable. People's consciousness shouldn't be able to change what this computer is doing. But the most remarkable experiment that he did, he stored the data. Let's say he stored it from yesterday. Nobody looked at it. It wasn't printed out. And he brought someone into the lab the next day and said, see if you can change yesterday's data between 2 and 3 in the afternoon so it's not random. And lo and behold, they'd go and look at it after that, and that would be the only time of that day the data was not random by a significant amount. Well, that's mind-boggling. How can you change the past? That's already happened. It's carved in stone. Well, this is our usual perception that we're just stuck and moving through linear time, but actually, Pure Light would talk about this a lot, a phenomenon called retrocausality. The present can change the past. So it opens up the door to so many possibilities of what's happening in our spiritual awakening that, like I said earlier, it's not just for our own benefit. We're actually doing something that's of service to the whole world.
Well, so I decided to share a little story. This happened, what was it, yesterday, I guess. Munira, she's here, and I'm telling our story, Munira, that I sent some masks so that she can use them when she's working on people in her practice and her massage. I sent 5 masks, and Azurbash packaged them up and put them in the mail, and we sent them, and she wrote back to me saying, oh, thank you for the 4 masks. There were 4, weren't they? And I got right back to her and I said, well, actually there were 5. And she said, well, it did kind of look like the package was opened up and maybe we lost one here or something, or I wonder what happened. So I said, well, I'll just go ahead and send another one. And I thought it'd be fun too to assign this one to an angel, because I really hadn't assigned angels to the others. I assigned an angel, and I wrote to her that we'll have this angel watch over this mask and get it to you. So she, within an hour, she wrote to me and said, I found the mask. It was on the driveway. And I said, well, yes, how wonderful. This angel is really able to do things. And I guess using what you were just talking about, you know, we could say, well, it was just dropped on the driveway. And most of the things that are events that happen outside of our usual consciousness can be dismissed that way. But I'd like to think of it as something else. So, and I'd like to add something now about the resurrection body. I think that most of us are interested, since that's part of our title, and discuss, and you'll see some differences too in the way that Azurbash and I present, and that's kind of fun to me, that he has some things from science and facts to back him up, and a nice organized way of thinking about it. And sometimes I'll kind of jump in with some ideas or some things that happened to me, and certainly more about mythology and the ideas of the Zoroastrians. But hopefully this will give you 2 ways of thinking about things. So resurrection body, we had some work in this last retreat that was down here in Corpus Christi with Pirzia. And he did a beautiful job of speaking about 3 marriages through which we work with the dream body, and then gradually the resurrection body, and finally the philosophical child, and approach gradually the resurrection body. And some things that I like to share about that is, and through my experience, is that it's an incredibly illuminative structure. It is a part of ourself that you could say transcends certainly our material condition, but it can be something that we are living in our awakened life. As Azurbash and I were speaking in planning for this, we're talking about, we think that we're living in this material plane, and certainly a lot of our consciousness is thinking about things of this material plane, but could it be that we're actually existing in a multidimensional world, many more dimensions that we think, and just part of us is participating in this material way. Well, this resurrection body would be one that would have a capacity to be functioning in a much different way. You could say very illuminative, multidimensional, reflecting what is around it, at the same time reflecting what is within it, awakened to many beings and to many past and present beings, and one that has many ways of functioning that we haven't so far developed, but are very possible for these human beings, these divine beings in the form of humans, to be able to accomplish. And there's a quote from Pir Vilayat: "Die before death and resurrect now." So it is not only some formation that comes at the end of our lives. This is a part of us that really can exist within this life. And it is to us to find ways to find the answers. Each one of us having different stories, like he said about the different allegories, yes, that each one of us has a different way. And I'm so thankful that in the Sufi tradition there are so much appreciation for differences and uniquenesses, as Azarbash was saying. But we can, in many different kinds of ways, find our path, and we really need to be looking for what is it in our own desire that is calling something forth. That is no accident that we have all the different, ishq is a beautiful word in the Sufi vocabulary, ISHQ, because it sounds like an aching. There's an aching within us that needs to be fulfilled. And in that fulfillment comes all of the different possibilities that become actualities in our own way of doing things that we can do, and things that we come to do in greater light, the light of the consciousness of all different beings, in the light of the consciousness of all the animals and the plants. And the wider that scope becomes, then the more beautiful this resurrection body becomes. We have many more classes that we're going to be spending thinking about this kind of thing.
So speaking of desire, Hasbernite Khan says that every desire begins with a divine impulse. And so for many years I thought, well, and he would also say that original impulse gets distorted sometimes 180 degrees by the time it gets through our consciousness in the world. And so for many years I thought, well, the idea is just to recover that original impulse the way it was, and it's kind of like marching orders, go ahead and carry it out. But I came to realize that's just kind of the launching seed intention on the divine side of things, and the divine has no way of knowing what's going to come from that, how it's going to be transformed by our experiences in the world. And by our participation in experiencing that deep impulse and transforming it by what's coming through our own creative faculties and our way of relating to the subtler levels of our being, then something is birthed that could only happen by the linkage of both the human and the divine sides of our being. So it's the fulfillment of, you could say, our desire. It's also the fulfillment of the divine desire. And it's a possibility that is not predetermined. It's not sitting there waiting for us to find what it is and, okay, here's the blueprint, I'm just going to do it the way that it is. And it's like if an artist or a musician is creating a piece or composing something, they may start with some kind of framework, but if they really get inspired, something's going to come through that they didn't consider to start with, that's a lot better than what they thought that was going to be by that participation with that. So all along the way, we're always operating from a particular frame of reference. It's our vantage point. It's how we understand ourselves and how we're in relationship with whatever it is that we're experiencing. And generally, we start by feeling a sense of separation. This is me, and here's everything else out there. And so we're having a dualistic way of relationship with whatever it is that we're experiencing. And then we might think, okay, I'm going to try to reach the aim of the yogis and go into the highest state of samadhi and dissolve my individuality and merge into the infinite unknowable, or in Buddhism, go beyond any sense of personal being into the, you can't even describe what it is. It's beyond form, beyond non-form. But in the Sufis, at least many Sufis say higher than unity is a state of separation, because only in a state of separation can there be that relationship of love and lover and beloved. And this is a path of juiciness. We like juiciness. We like intensity. We like passion. But for this to really be fulfilled, we have to discover a way of going beyond being separated from the object of our experience, and at the same time not losing the uniqueness of who we are in the very deep connection and relationship with what we're experiencing. So a term that came to me many years ago for this is relational unity. It's in a state of mutual co-presence with whatever we're experiencing, that something is born from that. The Sufis talk about a light upon a light, or a third presence that arises, and that's happening all the time if we're open to it. I mean, it can happen all the time just going around in our daily life, how we perceive situations, how we derive meaningfulness from what we're experiencing instead of reactions to what we're experiencing. So one thought that has been very meaningful for me is the notion that everything, without exception, is a potential portal, P-O-R-T-A-L, to the sacred. And it's our way of coming to relate to that either opens it up to something where sacredness can come through, even in the most awful, difficult situation, or the total opposite response, pulled back, reacting, closed down, feeling even more separated.
It's almost time to do a practice.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay, so I'd like to take you through one of my favorite little visualizations. And a lot of times, I had this book I discovered in college. It was called The Lazy Man's Guide to Life. And so I think many times we think we have to work too hard to have breakthroughs in our consciousness. So this practice is a bit of a shortcut that you can try on your own, and try it now and see how it works for you. So I will ask of you to see if you can agree with an assumption. And if you believe what Murshid Hazrat Khan said, then you'd have to agree with this. Murshid said that every atom eventually will have its moment of awakening. Well, we're made out of countless atoms, so if that's true for the atoms, it must be true for us. So if you believe at some point in time, or beyond this lifetime, eventually, however far into the future, that you will achieve illumination. If you believe that that's the case, and if you didn't believe that, I don't know why you'd want to pursue a spiritual path, because you wouldn't be getting your money's worth out of it if you didn't think it was going to eventually get you there. But if you believe that that's the case, so close your eyes. And now just imagine yourself at that, however distant time in the future, beyond this life, perhaps in some subtle realm of existence, that you have achieved illumination. You've become an illuminated, realized being. And you can prime the pump with this, so to speak, by just imagining some other realized being, like Buddha or Christ. But then imagine that eventually, well, Jesus said, everything I've done, you can do and more. So if you believe what he said is true, that's true for you, that eventually you will be in that state of being. So just imagine and just give yourself permission just to jump into it without trying to work too hard to figure out, well, let's see, would it look like this or that? And how it just jump into it. Your illuminated self in the future. And feel what your experience is now. You realize yourself as a being that transcends space and time, but also can function in any and all the realms in space and time and beyond. Be able to connect with great beings and angels and archangels and other realized beings, the spiritual hierarchy, which you now are a part of. And from this state of illumination, you have access to the awareness of your existence prior to becoming illuminated at any point in the past, including this particular time, wherever you are on this Zoom call, sitting in a chair. So imagine your illuminated being in the future now is contemplating you in the present. And your illuminated being is realizing that this you in the present is very much a part of that illuminated being of the future, because that being encompasses all the times of your existence. And now shift your vantage point to yourself, sitting wherever you are, experiencing your illuminated self from the future, like right there with you, right in front of you. And you can feel all this light and this expansive consciousness. The divine countenance, unique divine face of your being shining through clearly and radiantly. Now something begins to dawn on you. A huge aha moment, and you realize that you couldn't possibly perceive this illuminated state of your being that seemingly is in the future unless that was something available to you right now, that is your true being. And it's like you've looked into a mirror of truth and you can see your true self. It's like seeing God, seeing you, seeing God, seeing you. And you just feel this powerful transmission, awakening energy of pure spirit. And you realize the truth of something that a Sufi hundreds of years ago said, and I'll paraphrase it. He said, "Oh man, oh woman, if you but knew that you are free, it's your thought of captivity that has kept you in chains. You are free." You are a living embodiment of divinity in a name and form unique throughout all of existence. And this illuminated self, seemingly the future sitting in front of you, now merges with you, and it's just you. And you realize you've had your focus on a particular slice of space and time, and the sacredness of having this physical body, as Pirvalite would say, this spacesuit to experience the conditions of the physical world, this sacred body that we are giving a blessing to inhabit. But you are a being whose essence is freedom and light and wisdom. And joy. And you realize now that you are a source of blessing. And you can think the Buddhist prayer, the beautiful Buddhist prayer, but you can really feel it actualizing with your thoughts into a reality with the thought of love. Let me encompass the world. And may that love increasing without measure encompass the whole universe up to its confines. With the thought of peace, let me encompass the world. And may that peace increasing without measure encompass the whole universe up to its confines. And in particular for the state of the world now with the thought of healing. Let me encompass the world. And may that healing increasing without limit encompass the whole universe up to its confines. And now every breath received is a blessing. Every breath given is a blessing. Amen.
Let's close this section with a poem that I bring you. I breathe the air of a new place that satisfies the gasping of my whole life. The magnetism has been restored between my lifetime of searching and the certainty of being found.